They were 7 years old. Matching red polka-dot swimsuits. Matching gap-toothed smiles. Matching blue goggles pushed up on their foreheads like little crowns, as if the whole world was their swimming pool and they were its tiny queens. Their names were Lily and Lena Marchetti. And on the afternoon of July 14th, 2019, somewhere in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, surrounded by over 3,000 passengers, dozens of security cameras, and an entire crew of trained professionals, they were there one moment. And then they were simply gone. Not gone like a child who wanders off in a supermarket. Not gone like a kid who falls asleep in the wrong cabin. Gone in a way that made experienced investigators go quiet. Gone in a way that made a ship's security chief, a man with 22 years of maritime law enforcement behind him, sit down in his chair, stare at a blank monitor, and say nothing for a very long time. Gone in a way that no one, not the parents, not the captain, not the Coast Guard, not the dozens of detectives who would later pour over thousands of hours of footage, could fully explain. And 9 months after that afternoon, on a cold, gray morning in April 2020, a fisherman named Giorgio Anastas was walking along a narrow stretch of beach on the Greek island of Zakynthos. He wasn't looking for anything. He was just walking the way old men walk, slowly, with the kind of patience that only comes after decades of watching the sea take things and give them back on its own schedule. He almost missed it. Half buried in wet sand, covered in barnacles, dented and rusted in the color of a storm cloud. A suitcase. Old. Damaged. Sealed. He stood over it for a long moment, listening to the waves. Something about the way it sat there felt wrong to him. Not wrong like a piece of litter. Wrong like a secret. He called the local authorities. And what they found inside that suitcase would reopen a case that investigators had quietly, reluctantly, begun to let go cold. What was inside would raise questions so disturbing, so specific, that the lead investigator on the case, a woman named Detective Inspector Kalinikos, would later say in a recorded interview, "The moment I saw the contents of that case, I knew. Someone on that ship had planned this. Planned it. Not an accident. Not a tragedy born from carelessness or bad luck. Planned. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand what was found in that suitcase, and why it mattered so much, you first have to understand two little girls in red polka-dot swimsuits, laughing on a cruise ship deck, completely unaware that somewhere nearby, a darkness was moving toward them. Quick one before we continue. Where are you watching from? I love seeing how far these stories reach. Drop your location in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's get back into the story. The Marchetti family lived in a narrow, sun-soaked town called Albenga, in the Ligurian region of northern Italy. It was a kind of town where everyone knew your name, where the streets smelled of bread and sea salt, and where a family like the Marchettis, loud, warm, slightly chaotic, fit in perfectly. Marco Marchetti was 41 years old, a civil engineer, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the kind of deep laugh that people in restaurants turn around to look at. He was, by every account, a devoted father, the kind of man who coached his daughter's Saturday football team even though he was terrible at football, the kind of man who remembered both his daughter's teachers' names, their best friends' birthdays, their favorite ice cream flavors. His wife, Sophia, was 38. She was a primary school teacher, which, according to her colleagues, made her extraordinarily patient in ways that regularly amazed the people around her. She was quieter than Marco, more observant, the kind of person who noticed things. She remembered details. She paid attention. And together, Marco and Sophia had Lily and Lena. Born 17 minutes apart on a rainy October morning 7 years before the cruise, the twins were, in many ways, a perfect study in contrast. Lily was older by those 17 minutes, and she carried herself like she knew it. She was bold, chatty, the child who walked up to strangers in parks and announced her name and immediately asked if they wanted to be friends. She laughed loudly and often, with her whole body, the way children do before the world teaches them to be self-conscious. She was the one in the thumbnail photo, the one with the wider grin, the goggles slightly askew, already looking at the camera like she owned it. Lena was different. Not unhappy, never that, but quieter, more watchful. She had a habit of studying people before she spoke to them, a tiny crease forming between her eyebrows as she decided what she thought. She was the child who asked the questions that made adults pause, not because she was showing off, but because she genuinely wanted to know. She had been drawing since she was 3 years old. Detailed drawings, animals, maps of their neighborhood, portraits of her parents that were unsettling in their accuracy. Between them was an invisible thread that siblings sometimes have and twins almost always have, a closeness that didn't require words. Lily would start a sentence and Lena would finish it. Lena would feel something before she could name it, and Lily would have already moved to fix it. They were inseparable. Everyone said so. It was their defining feature in a town full of people who loved to define things. The cruise was Marco's idea. It had been a hard year. He'd been working on an infrastructure contract in Turin that had kept him away from home for months at a stretch. Sophia had been carrying the weight of the household, the school, the girls, alone. When the contract finally ended in June, Marco had sat down at his kitchen table, opened his laptop, and booked 7 nights aboard the Stella Adriatica, a mid-sized luxury cruise ship operated by Mediterranean Line, departing Genoa on July 12, 2019. It was supposed to be a reset, a thank you, a chance for the family to simply be together, unhurried and unworried, floating between beautiful places. Marco showed me the brochure. Sophia would later tell investigators, her voice careful and measured in the way of someone who has rehearsed every word before saying it to stop themselves from breaking. It had photographs of the pool deck. The girls saw it and they went crazy. Lily immediately started planning which swimsuit she would bring. Lena asked if there would be fish she could draw. She paused. I thought it was the perfect trip. The morning they departed Genoa, July 12, 2019, was warm and bright and smelled of engine oil and salt. The Stella Adriatica sat in the harbor like a small white city. 12 decks, 3 pools, 7 restaurants, a theater, a casino, a climbing wall, a kid club called the Explorer Zone with murals of cartoon sea creatures painted on its walls. Over 3,000 passengers. A crew of nearly 900. The Marchetti family walked up the gangway carrying too much luggage, wearing matching sun hats that Marco had bought at the last minute from a harborside shop and which made everyone, including him, look faintly ridiculous. Lily was already talking, to Sophia, to Marco, to the crew member who scanned their boarding passes, to the couple behind them in line, to no one in particular. Lena held her new sketchbook against her chest with both arms like it was a shield and looked up at the ship with those careful, measuring eyes. There's a photograph from that morning. Marco took it. It shows Sophia standing between the twins at the base of the gangway. All 3 of them are squinting slightly in the sunlight. Lena is gripping her sketchbook. Lily has one arm thrown around her sister's shoulder, mid-laugh at something just out of frame. Sophia has her hand resting on top of Lily's and she is smiling, genuinely, fully, without reservation. It is the last photograph of the whole family together in which all of them are smiling. The Stella Adriatica departed at 2 p.m. By 14:15, Lily and Lena were already in their swimsuits, already racing each other to the pool. By 4 p.m., they had made 3 new friends, eaten 2 ice creams each, and convinced a patient crew member to let them name the fish in the lobby aquarium. Everything was exactly as it should be. And then came the morning of July 14th. And something shifted. The Stella Adriatica was anchored off the coast of Sicily on the morning of July 14th, 2019. The sky was cloudless. The Mediterranean was the specific shade of blue that people travel thousands of miles to see, because there is simply no other blue in the world quite like it. It was, by any measure, a perfect day. And yet, Marco Marchetti woke at 7:15 a.m. with what he later described as a vague and sourceless unease. Not dread, not premonition, just that odd, flat feeling that sometimes visits people before bad days the way a cold front visits before a storm, arriving before the weather, carrying a chill that has no visible cause. He put it down to the rocking of the ship. He was not a natural sailor. Breakfast was served on the Lido deck from 7 to 10. The Marchettis sat at a round table with a white umbrella. Sophia ordered fruit and yogurt. Marco had eggs. Lily had waffles with chocolate sauce and ate them with a level of enthusiasm that made the couple at the next table laugh. Lena had toast and drew a small picture of the horizon in the corner of her sketchbook while waiting for her hot chocolate. Nothing was wrong. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing felt wrong. Not yet. Not clearly. But there was one moment. Later, when investigators began the exhaustive process of reconstructing the timeline of July 14th, this moment would come up again and again. Sophia would describe it first. Then Marco would confirm it independently when interviewed separately, as investigators always do. Halfway through breakfast, Lena put down her pencil. This was unusual enough for Sophia to look up from her coffee. Lena was staring at something across the deck. Not pointing, not commenting, just staring, in that focused, slightly unsettling way she sometimes had. Sophia followed her daughter's gaze. There was a man. He was sitting alone, 3 tables away, in the direction of the ship's railing. He was perhaps 50, perhaps older. It was hard to say. He had very pale skin despite the Mediterranean sun. He was dressed neatly but without any of the relaxed sloppiness of vacation. No shorts, no linen shirt. Dark trousers. A button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled precisely to the elbow. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that he wasn't drinking, and he was watching the Marchetti table. When Sophia met his eyes, he looked away, slowly, without hurry, as if being caught staring was simply beneath his concern. Sophia said nothing. She returned to her coffee. Lena picked up her pencil and went back to her drawing. Marco, who had been refilling his juice, missed the whole thing. It was probably nothing. It almost certainly was nothing. People stay on holiday. People space out, let their eyes wander, watch children because children are interesting. The man was probably bored, probably tired, probably not even seeing them, just staring at the general direction of their table because his mind was somewhere entirely different. Almost certainly, but Sophia would remember the man. And later, when investigators showed her a grid of photographs, she would choose his face from among 16 others in under 4 seconds. No hesitation. After breakfast, the family split briefly. Marco went to the gym. Sophia took the girls to the Explorer's Zone, where a morning activity, a treasure hunt around the ship, was scheduled for children aged 6 to 12. The zone's director, a cheerful Croatian woman named Petra Kovac, signed Lily and Lena in at 9:43 a.m. The activity ran until noon. Marco and Sophia collected the girls. Lunch. More pool time. A brief rest in the cabin while the ship began to move again, heading northeast toward the coast of Greece. At 4 p.m., the family went to the sky deck, the highest public deck, for the sail-away party. Music, drinks, streamers, children running through crowds of sunburned, laughing adults. Lily danced. Lena drew the coastline of Sicily shrinking behind them. At 6:30 p.m., Marco and Sophia decided to take the girls to the early dinner sitting in the main restaurant, the Poseidon Room, on Deck 5. It was quieter than the buffet. Nicer. A small treat. They dressed. They walked to the elevator. They descended. The time was 6:47 p.m. And this ordinary, unremarkable moment of a family pressing a lift button is, according to every piece of evidence, the last time all 4 Marchettis were in the same place at the same time. Because the elevator doors opened on Deck 5, and when Marco and Sophia stepped out, they turned to find only each other behind them. Lily and Lena had not followed. The elevator doors closed. In the first moments, there was no panic. This is important to understand, Because people sometimes judge it. They wonder why Marco didn't immediately sound an alarm, why Sophia didn't immediately scream. But this is what panic looks like in its first breath. It doesn't look like panic at all. It looks like confusion. It looks like a person pressing the elevator button again, waiting, expecting the doors to open and to find two little girls in red polka-dot swimsuits rolling their eyes as if their parents were being dramatic. Marco pressed the button. The elevator arrived. Empty. He pressed it again. Checked the adjacent elevator. Sophia was already in the corridor, looking both ways, calling their names in the slightly raised, casual voice of a parent who isn't yet worried but wants to establish quickly that there is nothing to worry about. Lily. Lena. Come on, girls. Nothing. They checked the stairwell, the deck corridor, the small seating area near the elevator bank. Marco went up one deck. Sophia went down. They met back at the elevator in 4 minutes. Nothing. It was 6:52 p.m. And now the edges of it began to arrive. That cold water feeling. The way the world sharpens and tilts slightly at the same time. Marco went to the nearest crew member, a steward named Andrei Petrescu, who was pushing a linen cart along the Deck 5 corridor. He explained quickly. The steward radioed his supervisor. The supervisor radioed guest services. It was 6:58 p.m. By 7:05 p.m., the head of the ship's security department, a former Italian police officer named Gianluca Ferri, was on his radio. By 7:15 p.m., every deck steward on the Stellar Adriatica had been alerted and was sweeping their assigned areas. The Explorer's Zone was checked. The pools. The restaurants. The theater. At 7:22 p.m., a general passenger announcement was made. Calm, measured, the voice of a woman accustomed to managing worry without adding to it. 2 children reported as separated from their family. Description given. Any passenger who sees them, please notify crew immediately. 3,000 passengers heard that announcement. Not one of them came forward with a useful sighting. By 7:42 p.m., 55 minutes after Lily and Lena were last seen, Gianluca Ferri had pulled up the ship's CCTV footage from every camera in the elevator bank area on decks 4, 5, and 6, covering the window from 6:45 p.m. to 7 p.m. He watched the footage. Once, twice, 3 times. And then he went very quiet. The camera covering the Deck 5 elevator bank showed the Marchetti family arriving and exiting cleanly. Marco. Sophia. 2 small girls in the same red swimsuits they'd been wearing all afternoon, now with dresses pulled over them for dinner. Clear as glass. The doors closed. The camera then showed Marco and Sophia, alone, exiting, waiting, pressing the button, looking at each other. But here's what the camera did not show. It did not show Lily and Lena exiting. Not on Deck 5. Not on any deck. The cameras covering every elevator exit on the ship, decks 1 through 12, showed nothing. No small girls. No red swimsuits. No polka dot dresses. It was as if the elevator had swallowed them. Ferri sat back in his chair. He made a decision he had hoped, in 22 years, he would never have to make. He picked up his radio and called the bridge. We need to consider the possibility, he said, that these children are no longer on board. The captain of the Stellar Adriatica, a Greek national named Captain Stavros Papadimitriou, ordered an immediate full ship lockdown at 8:04 p.m. No tenders, no crew transfers, no passengers to disembark at the next port until further notice. He then sent the radio call that would, within hours, bring Italian Coast Guard vessels and a Greek maritime patrol aircraft to the waters around the ship. They were searching the sea for 2 little girls, in the dark. By midnight on July 14th, the Stellar Adriatica was lit from bow to stern like a small city under siege. Coast Guard searchlights swept the water in long, cold arcs. Helicopters tracked the route the ship had taken since 6:47 p.m., calculating drift patterns, water temperatures, survival windows. Below deck, in a conference room that had been converted into a temporary operations center, Gianluca Ferri, and his team were doing something different. They were building a timeline. Every camera on the ship, 143 in total, was being reviewed. Every witness statement from crew and passengers who had been in the vicinity of the elevator banks and surrounding areas between 6:30 p.m. and 8 p.m. was being gathered and cross-referenced. Marco and Sophia were interviewed separately. This is standard. This is procedure. It is also, for parents sitting in separate rooms while their children are missing, an almost unbearable experience. Sophia answered every question with the careful, controlled precision of a woman fighting to stay useful. Marco answered with a raw, crumbling desperation of a man who had already begun to understand that this was not a mistake that was going to resolve itself in the next 5 minutes. The interviews produced the same story. Consistent. No contradictions. Two people telling the same truth. But as Ferry and his team dug deeper into the footage and the witness statements, they began to find things that didn't fit. The first discrepancy was small. A crew member named Dmitry Vasilev, a Romanian national who worked as a maintenance technician on the lower decks, had initially stated, in a brief preliminary interview, that he had not been near the elevator banks on Deck 5 at any point between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. He had been, he said, in the engine room maintenance area for his entire shift. But Camera 67, a partially obscured camera covering a service corridor on Deck 4, one deck below where the girls were last seen, showed Dmitry Vasilev walking in the direction of the Deck 4 stairwell at 6:49 p.m., 2 minutes after the Marchetti family entered the elevator. When investigators pointed this out to Vasilev, he corrected himself. He had stepped out briefly, he said, to get a coffee from the crew mess. He had forgotten. He was calm when he said this. Too calm, Ferry thought. The kind of calm that comes from preparation. Vasilev's cabin was searched at 1:15 a.m. Nothing was found. But Ferry flagged him, and he kept digging. The second inconsistency was bigger. A passenger, a retired German school teacher named Helga Brenner, traveling alone in a cabin on Deck 4, came forward at approximately 10:30 p.m. to report something she had initially dismissed as unimportant. She had been returning to her cabin from the sail-away party at approximately 6:55 p.m., 8 minutes after the twins were last seen. As she passed the stairwell at the far end of the Deck 4 corridor, she heard what she described as children's voices. She hadn't thought anything of it. It was a family cruise ship. Children were everywhere. But one of the voices, she said, had sounded distressed. Not crying, not screaming, just frightened. The way a child sounds when they are trying very hard to be quiet and brave but failing slightly at both. The stairwell she identified led, in its lower reaches, to the service decks of the ship, areas not accessible to passengers without a crew keycard. Ferry stared at the ship's blueprint for a long moment. The service decks. He immediately ordered a sweep of every service and maintenance area on the lower 3 decks of the ship. The sweep took 3 hours. Nothing was found. And yet, the stairwell that Helga Brenner had passed, the one from which she had heard those voices, had only one camera. And that camera, Ferry discovered at 3:17 a.m., had been non-operational since July 13th, the day before the twins disappeared. A work order had been submitted for its repair, but the repair had not yet been carried out. Ferry read the work order 3 times. The work order had been submitted by Dmitry Vasilev. By the time the Stella Adriatica docked in Athens on July 16th, 2 days behind schedule, the case had already become international news. 2 Italian children missing from Mediterranean cruise ship. The headlines appeared in Italy, Greece, France, Germany, the UK, and eventually everywhere else. Photographs of Lily and Lena, the ones from the gangway in Genoa, the ones from the pool deck, the laughing, gap-toothed faces with the blue goggles, appeared on television screens and phone screens and newspaper front pages in 32 countries. The family's appeal for information, delivered by Marco in a hotel lobby in Athens, was watched by millions of people. He spoke in Italian, haltingly, with the particular devastation of a man who is not yet able to accept the magnitude of what he is describing. He held a photograph of the twins in both hands. Sophia did not appear in the appeal. She was not able to. The investigation formally transferred to a joint task force. The Italian National Police, the Greek Coast Guard's Criminal Division, and Europol's Specialist Missing Persons Unit. Detective Inspector Kalinikos was assigned as lead investigator on the Greek side. She was 39 years old. She had spent 11 years working missing persons cases. She was, by every account, exceptional at her work. She was also, from the first briefing, troubled. The anomalies, she would later say, were too specific to be coincidental. The disabled camera. Vasilev's false statement about his location. The voices in the stairwell. The work order. But Vasilev was interviewed again, formally this time, with lawyers present, and he did not break. His story was now consistent. The brief D2 to the coffee mess was an honest memory lapse. The camera work order was routine. He was the assigned technician for that section of the ship. The camera had been reported faulty by a passenger 2 days prior. He had submitted the work order as required. Everything he said was, on its surface, verifiable. And yet it all sat wrong. The theories proliferated. They always do in cases like this, in the vacuum left by facts. Theory 1. Accident. The girls had somehow made their way to an outer deck, either alone or while being escorted back to their cabin by a well-meaning but now terrified passenger or crew member, and had gone overboard. It was terrible. It happened on cruise ships. Rarely. But it happened. Children climbed railings. Things happened. But the rail height on the Stella Adriatica was 1.2 meters. Lily and Lena were both under 1.25 meters tall. And the outer deck cameras, while not comprehensive, showed nothing consistent with 2 children near the railings between 6:47 p.m. and 8 p.m. Theory 2. They were still on the ship. In a hidden space. A maintenance shaft. A storage hold. The ship had been searched. But ships are vast and complex things, full of the kind of spaces that can hide things the designers never intended to hide. But the search had been thorough. Dogs had been brought on board in Athens. Nothing. Theory 3. They had been taken. Off the ship. By tender. By rope. By a small inflatable. Transferred to a waiting vessel while the ship moved and the passengers danced at the sail-away party. Human trafficking in the Mediterranean was not a theoretical concern. It was a documented, operational, vicious reality. Children were targeted. Children disappeared. This theory was the one that the investigators returned to most often and most reluctantly, because it was the one that made the most operational sense. Someone with knowledge of the ship. Someone with access to restricted areas. A planned transfer to a waiting vessel. But if that was true, then the question became, who? And why these 2 children specifically? Weeks passed. The Coast Guard expanded its search. Europol flagged the case across 17 national systems. Tips flooded in, thousands of them. Children spotted in Albania, in Turkey, in Egypt. Each one followed up. Each one leading nowhere. Each one draining resources and hope in approximately equal measure. By August, the tips had slowed to a trickle. By September, the Joint Task Force had reduced its active personnel on the case. By October, Kalinikos was one of only 3 investigators still officially assigned. By December, 5 months after the disappearance, the case had the official status of active but stalled. The Marchetti family had returned to Albenga. Their house was the same. Their street was the same. The town was the same. And yet everything was permanently, irrevocably different in the way that only catastrophic loss can make things different, as if the color had been drained from the world and replaced with a nearly identical but fundamentally wrong substitute. Sophia had stopped teaching. She sat, mostly, at the kitchen table where Marco had once booked the cruise, and she answered email from strangers who claimed to have information, and she followed every social media account dedicated to finding her daughters, and she did not sleep more than 3 hours at a time. Marco had returned to work, not because he wanted to, because staying home and watching Sophia do those things was something he couldn't survive. Christmas came and went. The new year arrived. The case grew colder. And then came the morning of April 3rd, 2020. And an old Greek fisherman walked along a beach. Giorgio Anastas was 6 to 7 years old. He had been fishing these waters since he was 12. He knew the currents around Zakynthos the way other men know city streets. Intimately, instinctively, aware of every quirk and tendency and habit. He knew what the sea brought in and from where. It was 6:15 a.m. when he found the suitcase. The beach was called Suitcase, a long, curved stretch of sand on the southeastern tip of the island, protected, quiet, the kind of place where sea turtles nest. In April, before the tourists arrived, it was almost always empty. The suitcase was at the waterline, half buried in wet sand, surrounded by a tangle of dried seaweed that suggested it had been there for at least one high tide, possibly more. It was old, hard-sided, the kind of suitcase that hadn't been made for 20 years, with a combination lock that had corroded shut and a frame that had been bent in at least 2 places, as if by significant impact or long pressure. Its color was impossible to determine under the barnacles and rust. But Giorgio would later tell investigators, "I have found many things on this beach over 50 years. Nets, crates, pieces of boat. Once, an inflatable dinghy. I have never found anything that made me feel the way this did." He called the Zakynthos Municipal Police at 6:23 a.m. 2 officers arrived by 6:55 a.m. The suitcase was photographed in situ. The area was taped off. A sergeant who had been half listening to the radio muttered something to his colleague. His colleague called their supervisor. Their supervisor called Athens. Athens called Kalinikos at 8:11 a.m. She was in her office. She had been in her office since 7 a.m., which was when she usually arrived. Even now, even with the case officially at minimum resources. She picked up the phone on the second ring. "We have a suitcase," the voice on the other end said. "Zakynthos. Washed up overnight." A pause. "It might be nothing," the voice added. "Carefully. Send me the photographs," Nikos said. They arrived 7 minutes later. She looked at them on her computer screen. The suitcase. The beach. The barnacles. The rusted frame. She stared at one photograph in particular. A close-up of the suitcase's surface near the handle, where the barnacles were thinner, where something was visible underneath. A marking. Faded. Almost gone. But still there. Barely. A series of letters and numbers. She checked her case file. The Marchetti's luggage manifest from the Stella Adriatica, filed by the ship's porter on July 12, 2019. She found the entry. She sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up, put on her jacket, and drove to the airport. The suitcase was a Marchetti family bag, registered to Sofia Marchetti, stored in the cargo hold of the Stella Adriatica from July 12 to July 16, and, according to the ship's records, collected by the family when they disembarked in Athens. Except Sofia Marchetti, when contacted by telephone while Nikos was en route to Zakynthos, stated clearly and emphatically that she had never received that suitcase. It had been lost. She had reported it lost in the chaos of the disembarkation, in the horror and the fog of those days after the ship docked. The lost suitcase had barely registered. Of course it had barely registered. But someone had that suitcase. Someone had it. And someone had put it in the sea. The suitcase was opened by forensic technicians at 2:30 p.m. on April 3, 2020, in a police facility in Zakynthos. Kalinikos was present. She wore gloves. She stood back while the technicians worked. The lock was cut. The case was opened. Inside, sealed in vacuum-packed plastic that had kept it dry. A miracle, given the state of the case, were the contents. Children's clothing. Specifically, 2 red polka-dot swimsuits. 2 pairs of blue swimming goggles. A small notebook, its cover decorated with stickers of marine animals, which, when carefully opened, was filled page after page with detailed drawings. Drawings of the sea, of a ship, of coastlines, of animals. of two small figures with gap-toothed smiles who appeared in many of the drawings, always together, always at the edge of some horizon. Lena's sketchbook. Nikos looked at those drawings for a long time. She did not speak. The forensic technician beside her did not speak either. At the bottom of the case, beneath the clothing, wrapped separately in waterproof material, was something else. A mobile phone. Burner model. No SIM card. No contacts. Wiped. But not fully wiped. Because a phone that has been factory reset is not the same as a phone that has been forensically wiped. And the digital forensics team that took possession of it within the hour would discover, over the following 72 hours, something that would crack the case open like a fault line splitting the earth. The data recovered from the burner phone was fragmentary, partial, corrupted in places. But it was enough. It was enough. The forensic team worked through April 4th and April 5th without stopping. What they reconstructed, piece by piece, was not a complete picture, but it was a map. And a map, even a partial one, is enough to show you where you need to go. The phone had been used to send and receive encrypted messages. The encryption had been partially broken by the reset. Not fully, but enough. The messages were short, coded, in places. But the content, the sequence, the timestamps, they told a story. A story that began before July 14th. Before the cruise. Possibly weeks before. Kala Nikos brought in Europol's cybercrime division. She also contacted the Italian National Police and shared what she had. Within 24 hours, the Joint Task Force was fully operational again. All hands, all resources, all eyes on the evidence. What emerged over the following 2 weeks was this. The disappearance of Lily and Lena Marchetti was not random. This was the first and most devastating conclusion. These were not two children who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had been selected. Specifically. Deliberately. Someone had known they would be on that ship. Someone had planned, in advance, what would happen to them. The question was how. The second conclusion was this. The girls had not gone overboard. Not accidentally. Not deliberately. The suitcase, the phone, the evidence of planning, all of it pointed toward the same operational reality. This was an abduction. An organized, premeditated abduction, conducted on a moving ship. The how was answered, piece by piece, by the evidence. Dmitry Vasilev, the maintenance technician who had submitted the work order for the disabled camera, was arrested on April 19, 2020, at his home in Constanta, Romania, by Romanian and Europol officers. He had left the employ of the cruise line in August 2019, 1 month after the disappearance, citing personal reasons. He had returned to Romania quietly. He had been, by his neighbors' accounts, perfectly normal, quiet, employed at a local logistics company. Unremarkable, but his financial records told a different story. In the 6 months following July 2019, a series of payments, anonymous, routed through a chain of shell accounts across 4 countries, had been deposited into a Romanian bank account that Vasilev had opened 3 months before the cruise. The account had been in a different name, but the biometric verification for online banking had been Vasilev's. He received money, significant money, for a specific job, under questioning, and it took a long time, and it required the kind of pressure that only the arrest of someone you care about can generate. Vasilev eventually confirmed what the investigators had already largely pieced together. He had been recruited, approached through channels he was unwilling to name, through a layer of intermediaries he could only partially describe. He was told only what he needed to know. A family would be on the ship. 2 young girls. They were to be taken off the ship before it docked. A vessel would be waiting. He was to facilitate access to the lowest service decks, ensure the relevant camera was disabled, and be available to assist at the moment of transfer. He was also told, in terms that left no ambiguity, what would happen to him if he refused, or if he spoke. He did not know who had hired the people above the people who had contacted him. He did not know the destination of the vessel. He did not know what the girl's ultimate fate had been planned to be. He knew only his piece of the operation, and his piece had worked. The girls had been separated from their parents in the elevator, not by chance, but because the elevator had been tampered with. A device attached to the door mechanism of the car the Marchettis had boarded caused the doors to close and the car to ascend to Deck 7 before the adults could react, leaving the children effectively isolated in the lobby area of the floor the elevator had been called from. In the 38 seconds before Marco and Sophia realized something was wrong and returned to that floor, Lily and Lena had been met in the corridor by a second individual, never identified, who had moved them quickly to the service stairwell. The stairwell where Helga Brenner had heard a frightened child's voice. From there, in the confusion of the sail-away party, 3,000 people on the upper decks, music, noise, nobody watching the waterline. The girls had been transferred via a small rigid inflatable craft to a waiting vessel. In the dark, in the noise, in the crowd, in plain sight and invisible at the same time. Now came the part that would never quite leave Kalanickos, no matter how many years passed. The suitcase. The suitcase had not been intended as evidence. It had been Sophia's bag, taken from cargo hold storage during the chaos, intended to be stripped of identifying information and disposed of at sea. But something had gone wrong with the disposal. The items had been placed in the suitcase, perhaps temporarily, perhaps as part of a transfer, and the suitcase had been lost overboard, or thrown, or released into the sea by someone who didn't anticipate what 9 months of Mediterranean current would eventually return. Inside it, the girls' swimsuits, the sketchbook. Someone had kept them together, kept the girls' things together. Nikos would spend a long time thinking about why. She would ultimately conclude that it had been, in some cruel and complicated way, a form of care. That whoever had those items, not Vasilev, not the person above him, but someone further in the chain, had kept them as if keeping them meant something. As if the girls were people to whoever held those items, not commodities. Which was, in its own terrible way, the most heartbreaking detail of the entire case. The Europol investigation identified the man from the breakfast table, the pale man in dark trousers who had stayed at the Marchetti family the morning of the 14th. He was a Moldovan national with a documented history of involvement in organized trafficking networks across Eastern Europe. He had boarded the ship in Genoa under a false identity. He was never apprehended. The vessel that had received Lily and Lena, pieced together from partial AIS data and witness reports from a Greek fishing vessel that had observed an unregistered boat near the Stella Adriatica's route on the evening of July 14th, was tracked as far as the southern Albanian coast. And there, the trail ended. It simply ended. There's a particular kind of grief that has no ending, that doesn't arc toward resolution or acceptance the way other griefs sometimes manage to. It just remains. It occupies a room in you that never gets repurposed, never gets cleared out, never stops having exactly that shape, the shape of whoever is missing, like a space cut from paper in the form of a child. Marco and Sophia Marchetti lived in that grief. Vasilev was convicted in Romanian courts in November 2021 on charges related to human trafficking facilitation. He received 14 years. At his sentencing, he did not look at the camera. He did not speak. He had, throughout the entire process, declined to name anyone above him in the chain, either because he couldn't, or because he was more afraid of them than he was of 14 years. The man in the dark trousers remains on Europol's most wanted list. The vessel, the destination, the network above it. These things are known in outline and unknown in detail, which is perhaps the most maddening form of knowledge there is. Enough to understand the shape of what happened, not enough to finish it. As of the time this story is told, Lily and Lena Marchetti have not been found, but they have not been confirmed dead, either. And this is, for their parents, a thing that cuts both ways. It is a wound that cannot close because it cannot end. It is hope and it is torture simultaneously, and some mornings it is hard to know which one it is more of. Sophia returned to the kitchen table. She still answers emails. She still follows every account, every group, every organization that works to find missing children in the Mediterranean. She has become, without intending to, one of the most persistent advocates for reform in cruise ship security protocols in Europe. She has testified before the European Parliament. She has spoken at conferences. She has, in the methodical, precise way of a woman who once taught first graders to read and believes with her whole soul in the power of doing the next small useful thing, turned her grief into purpose. She is not okay. She says so directly when people ask. She is not okay, and she does not pretend to be. But she is still there. Marco is still there too. In Albenga, in the town that knows their names, the neighbors still leave food. The local parish still lights candles on the girl's birthday in October. And on the wall of the Marchetti kitchen, there is a drawing, framed, protected behind glass. It is one of Lena's drawings, not from the sketchbook. That is evidence now, sealed in an evidence locker in Athens. This one is older, from the year before. It shows two small figures with gap-toothed smiles standing at the edge of what might be the sea, or might be the sky, or might be both. Lena was 7 and her horizons were sometimes interchangeable. The two figures are holding hands. They are always holding hands. Detective Inspector Kalinikos still has the Marchetti file on her desk. Not because it is required. Not because she is still formally assigned. But because she has made a private and absolute decision that she will not put it away until there is something to put away with it. She checks the Europol updates. She follows the leads when they come. And they still come, occasionally. A tip from an NGO worker in North Africa. A photograph submitted by an aid organization. A name mentioned in a wiretap transcript from an unrelated trafficking case that might, or might not, cross paths with the network that operated on that ship. She follows everyone. The sea gives things back. Not always. Not everything. Not on anyone's schedule. But it gives things back. A rusted suitcase. A sketchbook full of horizons. A phone with half a story still readable in its damaged memory. And somewhere, in the turning, indifferent, beautiful Mediterranean that the Marchetti family crossed on a July afternoon in a world that still felt safe, somewhere in all of that water and all of that distance, there may still be answers waiting. Nikos believes this. Sophia believes this. And this is, finally, the only thing left to say about a case that has no clean ending. That the people who love Lily and Lena Marchetti have refused, absolutely, collectively, immovably refused, to stop looking. Because some truths are worth searching for no matter how long it takes. And some children are worth finding, no matter what the sea says. In places we think are safest, the truth can be hidden in plain sight. And the people left behind carry the weight of unanswered questions, not as a burden, but as a promise. If this story moved you, share it. Awareness saves lives. If you know anything about missing children in the Mediterranean region, organizations like Missing Children Europe and the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children operate active tip lines that work directly with law enforcement. For Lily. For Lena. For every child still waiting to be found.